A week in March, a week during which the UK was scheduled to be the first member country to exit the EU, but didn't. It's changed the destiny of Britain and of Europe. A week that raised existential questions that will not be resolved by politics, but only by a different kind of politics. So how will history see the implosion of the Brexit process, virtually from the moment that the agreement was signed and formally endorsed by the UK Prime Minister with the EU? That was back in November 2018 and was repeatedly and universally rejected by politicians from every side, and which triggered the greatest constitutional crisis in the UK since World War II. Brexit has divided the UK like no other issue. Voters, political parties, the constituent parts of the UK itself. It's led to cabinet resignations on a scale not seen before. And it's led to an extraordinary standoff with the EU. Extraordinary is the only word. The UK Prime Minister, Theresa May, who had begun as a supporter of the Remain campaign and then switched sides, having gained the premiership on the resignation of David Cameron, who had called and then lost a referendum on Brexit. A Prime Minister who signed an agreement pretty well universally rejected and was required to sign up for an uncertain and dependent future, prospectively requiring it to remain indefinitely within the EU customs union and internal market, which the British people, albeit by a narrow margin, had voted to leave. Brexit, after all, didn't mean Brexit. Dependency is a great instrument for maintaining control and mitigating all who might have the temerity to seek independence and autonomy. And that's what one's looking at here, dependence. And a Prime Minister consumed with getting the House of Commons to enact a deal opposed, as I said, for various reasons on all sides, and yet one which the EU would not modify, with flaws that the EU must have itself foreseen. A deal which imposed interminable humiliations on Mrs. May and on the UK itself in its constant engagements with Europe. How will history see Brexit? Well, it will see it not as the cause of a catharsis in Europe, but as an expression of a deeper crisis in the EU itself. Brexit will be seen as the canary in the EU coalmine, because from the outset, Brexit was an expression of this deeper existential crisis at multiple levels that had developed in Europe. Existential crisis, well, existential in the sense of challenging the identity of Europe, what it was once about and what it had become. Challenging what kept Europe together and challenging the tensions that have emerged between autonomy and the autonomy of nations and the hegemony which has progressively grown at the European core. Who now controls Europe? It's no longer a community. Probably the best expression of this was the Troika. The Troika imposed on vulnerable, dependent, debt-ridden countries and was an expression of Europe's imposition of control without recourse. Troikanomics imposed on Greece, where it sequestered political as well as economic governance. Where did Brexit go wrong? Was it the whole idea of Brexit? Or was it the process? Or the people managing that process? Or was it the cult of dependency, which has now sequestered really the European identity. It was seen in part by the establishment as a form of populism. But that doesn't really explain where it's coming from, because it was part of a much wider set of dissatisfaction and alienation that saw people coming out on the streets of Athens and more recently on the streets of Paris, engaging with an empire, not a community anymore, which was unable to listen. Brexit was also played out against a backdrop of three events. The first was the Treaty of Aachen between France and Germany, including the first joint meeting of the two parliaments. Basically, it affirmed that the Franco-German axis is Europe. It's what Europe is about. Secondly, the militarization of Europe, completely at odds with what the foundational values were about. And by militarization, the establishment of a European army is meant, and also the setting up of a European defense industry. And that's familiar to us. And of course, it was played out against a backdrop of the European elections. European elections for a parliament that lacks impact, but which deflects from where the power really lies. And there's more. The paradox of Brexit, that it was the Irish backstop that impaled the UK on this flawed deal. And Ireland afflicted by political amnesia, it seems, mindful neither of the relationship that was cultivated over centuries with Britain, or the existential austerity imposed on Ireland less than a decade ago. Political amnesia is a terrible thing, and it's worth remembering that when Ireland was at its most vulnerable, it was not the European institutions which advocated for it, but, wait for it, it was the IMF. So we're looking really at Britain leaving not Europe, but what Europe has become. A Europe fragmented by inequalities of different kinds and by different forms of crises, from macroeconomics to migration to militarism. Now, this tells us something. It tells us that Europe is fragmented, is in a set of crises that it hasn't resolved, and against which people are reacting. Brexit was one form of that. So this division, this dependency, this inequality tells us that something has been lost. Dependency is never healthy. There's a second point that really merits thinking about. In the middle of an interview with the former Prime Minister Tony Blair, the BBC Newsnight presenter Emily Maitlis turned to Mr. Blair, a former Prime Minister, and said, "We're in a mess. If ever there was a time when we needed spiritual guidance, it's now. We need it now in the management of Brexit. And is Brexit in your prayers?" That's what she said. And that's the point. The genesis of the European project was Christian democracy in Germany and in Europe. That is, the primacy of God, of marriage and family. It's all in the documents of Adenauer. And Christian virtues like social justice that flow from these values. So Emily's question would have made perfect sense to men like Adenauer and Monnet, who had built the European project on faith and on prayers. Yes, really. But Europe and the EU have been captured and colonized by an aggressive secular culture, including Ireland, which brought, incidentally, Christianity to a Europe that was broken in the Middle Ages. So to whom do you turn when you have crowded out God and a relationship with God, when you have crowded out Christianity as the foundation of Europe, there's no shared language, no values, no common values around which to unify. And so there's division, competition, standoffs. And so Europe has defaulted into power and hegemony, and the UK has experienced a meltdown into secular confusion. In our next reflections, we look at some of these issues in more detail. The future of an essentially post-Christian Europe, the nature and the different dimensions of its existential crisis, from which, incidentally, we have been deflected by Brexit, and that's the important point. We're looking in the wrong direction. And how a newly secularized Ireland was induced to turn away from its nearest neighbour, with whom it shared a border and a history, to impale a, albeit inept, UK government on an unnecessary backstop. A backstop which served the interests of the EU in keeping the UK dependent, and also served as a warning to other member states that might have the temerity to consider also reclaiming their autonomy. That is, their capacity to become more fully themselves amongst other nations, and which, paradoxically, has reinforced Ireland's own dependence as a small peripheral province of an EU empire, an empire which had begun as a community of free nations. Thank you.